Sit by the campfire. I have stories to tell. They're dark, sometimes frightening, and they're always true. But don't worry, you're safe with me. Tonight's crime is about a house in the middle of nowhere. It's in Oak Park Station, deep in the South Australian outback. The land out here is wide, unforgiving. Red-brown earth stretches in every direction, broken only by scrub that clings stubbornly to the soil. The sky feels enormous, pale, washed out during the day. It presses down on the ground beneath it. Heat lingers long after the sun begins to drop, radiating up from the land in slow, invisible waves. Oak Park Station covers around 148,000 acres. It's a scale that's hard to picture unless you've seen it for yourself. Not just large, but consuming. Distances blur, landmarks disappear. Once you step beyond the homestead, there is very little to orient you, unless you've lived somewhere like this. It's easy to underestimate just how rural it feels. Out here, isolation isn't subtle. It announces itself, especially when night begins to close in. As daylight fades, the colors drain from the land. The horizon darkens first, then the sky follows. Shadows stretch and merge. The air cools, but only slightly, carrying the dry smell of dust and heat-soaked earth. There are no nearby houses, no distant glow of street lights. When darkness arrives, it arrives fully. The silence that follows isn't peaceful, it's total. The station sits roughly 40 kilometers from the nearest town of Yunta. Around 60 people live in Yunta. It lies around 300 kilometers from Adelaide, connected by long, straight roads where hours can pass without seeing another vehicle. Life there is functional, unadorned, shaped by distance and necessity rather than choice. The air holds a dry sandiness, but there's beauty in the wilderness too. The town consists of the bare minimum. This isn't a place where tourists stay for very long. Everything exists for a reason. Nothing exists without purpose. Beyond the town, the land bears quiet reminders of earlier ambitions. Scattered across the surrounding area are the remains of small, short-lived mining operations dating back to the late 19th century. When gold prospectors moved on, they didn't take everything with them. Shafts were dug, then abandoned. Some collapsed, falling in on themselves over time. Others remained open, dark, gaping holes in the wasteland. Worse still, many were never properly mapped. They seemed to wait, dark and dry beneath the surface, hidden by dust, unchanged by time, and in a place this vast, where darkness and isolation work together, those hidden spaces matter. Little blonde-haired, brown-eyed Gus Lamont lived at Oak Park Station with his family, spread across the wide, sprawling homestead. The house wasn't crowded in the way city homes are crowded, but full in a different sense, full of lives overlapping in a place where there was nowhere else to go. Gus lived there with his mother, Jessica, his younger brother, and his grandparents, surrounded by land that seemed to stretch endlessly beyond the windows. Jessica's biological father, Josie, lived at the homestead, having transitioned in 2015. He and his family were private people, accustomed to isolation, used to living far from scrutiny and far from the noise of the outside world. Out here, privacy wasn't something you asked for. It was something the land enforced. Also living on the farm was Jessica's mother and Josie's wife, Shannon. And then there was Ronnie, Jessica's youngest child, just 1 year old at the time. Gus's little brother, a baby whose days were marked by naps, feeding, and the constant low-level sounds of life continuing, no matter what else pressed in around it. Life on a station like this came with its own rhythms. The mornings began early, often before the heat had fully settled, when the air still held a thin, fleeting coolness. Dust hung low and fine, coating boots, skin, and clothing, no matter how often it was brushed away. The smell of dry earth mixed with fuel, animals, and sun-warmed timber. There were flies, always flies, the steady hum of them filling the air, relentless, impossible to ignore. Work needed doing every day. Fences checked, animals tended, equipment maintained. Nothing out here stayed still for long, and nothing looked after itself. The land demanded attention, and it rarely waited for a convenient moment. Jessica was married to Joshua Lamont, an ex-country and western singer, a bearded, stocky man who enjoyed music and was accustomed to the quiet. But Joshua didn't live full-time at the homestead. Their relationship was fraught with conflict, much of it rooted in friction between Joshua and Josie, Jessica's biological father. It said Josie was very set in their ways. There were arguments over childcare. Joshua didn't like how his son was left outside to play. There were snakes, shafts, wildlife, all sorts of dangers to an inquisitive child. But complacency set in. For a family who had grown up in the desert wilderness and come to no harm, under one roof, in a place already shaped by heat, dust, and exhaustion. Those tensions had nowhere to escape. Living together like this, with so many adults, so many differing views, and so little space to retreat emotionally, would have been difficult even in comfort. Out here, it was harder still. Tempers frayed more quickly. Small disagreements lingered. The work never stopped, and neither did the pressure. Days bled into one another. The sun rose, the heat returned, the dust settled again, and beneath the routine, beneath the ordinary sounds of a working station and a family trying to coexist, there was a sense of strain. Not explosive, not dramatic, just constant. The kind that builds quietly, the kind that waits. And though no one living there could have known it at the time, the land that had always felt isolating was about to become something far worse. Gus's grandmother, Shannon Murray, was the last person to see him alive. It was around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, when the sun still sat high enough to cast long, hard-edged shadows across the ground. The heat of the day hadn't fully broken yet. Inside, there were sounds of life in the outback home. Muted, ordinary. Outside, Gus was playing happily on a mound of red dirt. The soil was fine, powdery, the kind that stains everything it touches. Gus was small against it, a little blonde-haired boy wearing a sun hat and boots, long sleeves pulled down against the sun, long trousers already dusted red at the knees. The mound wasn't new, it was familiar, a place he'd played many times before, close enough to the house to be watched from a distance, close enough to feel safe. Nothing about the moment suggested danger. Shannon went inside the house. The door closed behind her, shutting out the open space, replacing it with the sounds of the interior, the dull quiet of thick walls. Outside, the land remained still. About 30 minutes later, Shannon returned and called out for Gus. The sound of her voice carried briefly, then fell flat against the open space. The mound of red dirt sat where it always had, empty, no movement, no small figure shifting in the dust. She called again. The air felt heavier now, the quiet deeper. As she moved, dust rose faintly around her boots, the smell of dry soil sharp in her nose. The heat pressed in. Her mouth began to dry. She looked again, closer this time. Scanning the ground, the space around the mound, the stretch of land beyond it. There was nothing there. Her heartbeat quickened, thudding loud enough to feel in her chest. Her breathing grew shallow, uneven. The silence didn't break, it only expanded. Gus's mother, Jessica, and his grandparent, Josie Murray, were not at the homestead. They were approximately 10 kilometers away on the station property, searching for lost sheep. This was normal life for them, long distances, routine tasks, hours spent moving through open land without interruption. It was the kind of day that gives no warning before it turns. Back at the house, Gus's younger brother Ronnie was inside with Shannon, a 1-year-old, unaware of the urgency unfolding around him, unaware that his world was about to fracture. Gus's father, Joshua Lamont, was living around a 2-hour drive away. He wasn't at the property when Gus disappeared. At that moment, he knew nothing of the empty dirt mound, nothing of the rising panic, nothing of the search beginning to tear across the land. When Gus went missing, he was wearing a long-sleeved shirt, boots, a hat, long pants, clothing chosen for the outback, clothing meant to protect him. Shannon alerted Jessica and Josie. Soon, anxious voices began to carry across the station, calling Gus's name again and again. The sound echoed briefly, then vanished into the vastness. Sheds were opened, outbuildings searched, doors thrown wide, footsteps kicked up dust as the search widened, movements becoming faster, more frantic. For the next 3 hours, the family searched. As the sun dropped lower, the light thinned and shadows lengthened. The heat finally began to ease, replaced by a creeping coolness that settled over the ground. Darkness closed in steadily, swallowing detail, narrowing what could be seen. Voices grew hoarse, throats dried. Each call for Gus felt sharper, more urgent than the last. There was no sign of him, no disturbance in the dirt, no mark suggesting a struggle, no indication of where he might have gone. It had been a clear, sunny day. The land offered nothing. It was as if Gus Lamont had vanished into thin air. As night fully took hold, the station fell into a different kind of silence, heavier, more oppressive. Tears came. The land that had always felt vast now felt endless. And somewhere within that darkness, a child had vanished, leaving behind only unanswered calls. The family contacted police at around 8:30 that evening. They were not people who reached outward easily. Life on the station had taught them to solve problems themselves, to rely on what was close at hand, to endure rather than ask. Calling for help meant something had gone very wrong. It meant there were no more places left to look. By the time the call was made, voices were strained and raw. The air inside the homestead felt thick and stale. Hands shook as they held the phone. Outside, night had fully settled, bringing with it a cold that crept up from the ground and into the bones. This was a dangerous sort of cold, unforgiving for a small child out on his own. 3 precious hours had already slipped away. When police arrived, they moved with quiet urgency. Torches cut narrow beams through darkness, sweeping across red dirt, fence lines, sheds. doors were opened, outbuildings checked again, more thoroughly this time. Every space where a child might have wandered, crawled, or fallen asleep was searched. A single footprint was found 500 meters from the homestead. It gave a flicker of hope, because a clue was better than nothing. But police discounted it. Experienced trackers came in, saying this was like nothing they had dealt with before. They couldn't understand how there wasn't one trace of the little boy's movements. Low voices carried between officers, brief, controlled. Information was passed back to police control, times confirmed, locations noted, radios crackled softly, the sound sharp against the vast stillness of the land. Attention shifted carefully, methodically. The homestead was searched. The people closest to Gus were spoken to. Details were checked, then checked again. Questions were asked plainly, without accusation, but with purpose. Police worked through possibilities the way they always do, testing what fit, discarding what didn't, watching closely for what remained unexplained. The wilderness out here was not passive, it was active. It swallowed sound, it hid distance and disorientated the people searching on its land. The ground was uneven, scattered with scrub and loose earth. Old fencing rusted quietly in the dark. Insects filled the air with a low, constant hum. Then there was the scrub, prickly, sharp. Somewhere farther out, an animal moved, unseen. The temperature dropped as the night deepened. Every step erased former tracks. Search teams grew. Police, volunteers, and emergency services worked to exhaustion. Spreading outward across the station, ground searches pushed through scrub and open land. Air searches scanned vast spaces from above. Lights swept back and forth across the darkness. Water sources were checked. Every effort was made. The press gained momentum as Gus's story was told far and wide. Every option pursued. Still, there was nothing. No sign of Gus, no clothing, no disturbance, no blood or tire tracks. The hours continued to pass, marked by radio updates and the slow rotation of exhausted searchers. The pressure built steadily, silently, as it always does in cases like this. Time mattered. Everyone there knew it. Gus's family withdrew into themselves. They didn't want to hear from the outside world. The clock was ticking, with an impending sense of doom. And with each passing minute, the vast outback seemed to hold its secrets close as the search pressed on into the night. Searchers pushed themselves on, stopping only briefly to drink water that barely eased their thirst. Mouths stayed dry, lips cracked, shirts clung heavy with sweat and dust. No one wanted to be the one who stopped too soon. The one who turned back while there was still land left to cover, because many of these people had children of their own, and somewhere out there, a little boy was still missing. But was he still alive? The community came together quickly. More people arrived from nearby properties and towns. Vehicles lined the edges of tracks, but alongside the effort, questions began to form. How could a small child simply vanish? Why hadn't someone been watching him more closely? Why weren't the police called quicker? Why wasn't his father told until much later on? The land offered no clear answers. There were no birds of prey circling overhead. Assigned searchers would have recognized immediately had there been remains exposed somewhere in the wilderness. There were no signs of disturbance in the dirt, nothing dragged, nothing broken. A wild boar attack would have left marks. It would have torn the ground. Screams would have been heard. There was nothing like that. The property was bordered by a large fence. Dingoes were not common in the area. A bird of prey would not have been strong enough to carry a child Gus's size. And police stated there was no possibility of a random abduction, given the layout of the land and the isolation of the location. Still, the questions didn't stop. Police drained an entire dam. Water was pumped out slowly, methodically. Expectant, they held their breath as the exposed ground searched, but there was nothing. The family's home was checked again. Every room, every wardrobe, every possible space, every place that could be opened was opened. Radios hummed constantly. Rumors began to circulate beyond the search zone, carried through news reports and online speculation. Demands for answers grew louder. As time passed, the tone shifted. Police said they were hoping for a miracle. It was a phrase spoken carefully. Behind it sat a sad reality. After consulting with medical professionals, police informed the family that there was very little chance of finding Gus alive. Speculation intensified. Some suggested there had been an accident and that the family was hiding the truth. The pressure on them increased, arriving from every direction. Police addressed these rumors directly during press appeals, warning journalists to give the family privacy. There was no grounding to the claims. What the family needed, police said, was time to cope with Gus's loss. From the outset, police stated that they did not believe foul play was involved. That position was held carefully, but they also made it clear they were open to any possibility that could explain how Gus had vanished. Nothing was ruled out or dismissed outright. People asked why Gus's father, Joshua Lamont, was not informed that his son was missing until police contacted him the following morning. This delay quickly became a point of focus, not because it proved anything, but because it raised questions that would not easily settle. Joshua lived around 2 hours' drive away. He and Gus's mother, Jessica, were in what was described as a commuter relationship. Distance was already built into their family life, but even so, the silence lingered. Why hadn't he been told? This wasn't the only behavior that drew attention. The family provided just one photograph of Gus for police to use in appeals. They did not take part in media interviews. They did not stand before cameras. At one point, Josie was seen holding a gun while warning members of the press away. Later, it was said the firearm was being used to shoot a snake, but the image lingered. If snakes were close enough to the house to pose a threat, questions naturally followed. Why had 4-year-old Gus been left outside alone for 30 minutes in front of the homestead? Search volunteers were instructed to stay away from the property. Jessica, Gus's mother, was rarely seen during this period. Her parents were present, visible, moving through the search zone, but Jessica remained largely out of sight. After Gus's disappearance, Joshua moved to a property farther out from Adelaide, land owned by Jessica's grandparents. In the days that followed, Gus's family released a statement. They spoke of devastation, of hearts that were aching, but also of hope, a hope they were not yet ready to let go of. They expressed their thanks to the emergency services and to the community members who had come out to help, people who searched, who waited, who stood with them in the heat and then in the dark. Police returned to the remote property where 4-year-old Gus Lamont disappeared. They said nothing was off the table, but to date, Gus Lamont has still not been found. You may or may not have formed your own opinion about what happened. That's natural. Cases like this leave space for questions, space for uncertainty. If you'd like, you can share your thoughts in the comments. And let me know what kinds of stories you'd like me to tell next. For now, this story ends where it began, with a quiet landscape and a child who never came home. This has been Edward. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourself. And remember, some stories don't end. They simply fade into the dark. Good night. Sleep well. And I hope you'll join me again soon.